Very, very, very good description. I really appreciate that. So now let's back up a little bit. Let's go to the point of the idea, because I frequently have people, for example, on Twitter or whatever, I have people who come to me with ideas, and I'm asking you to answer the question basically for reiteration purposes. Is having a good idea enough?
Enough for what?
Is having a good idea enough to approach someone with a query letter?
Well, that's a difficult question because there's so many ways to answer it. In my career, I've often developed a good idea through the writer's lifeline into a sellable book. But having a good idea by itself, unless you're willing to get editorial help, is really not something you should be pitching because, for one thing, if you're not dealing with a trustworthy source, you could lose your idea. Ideas are not copyrightable or protectable. But if you come to me for the writer's lifeline and you say, I have a good idea, I need to find somebody to help me turn this into a book or a script, I mean, that's what we do. We're kind of a literary clearinghouse in that regard. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
No, you answered it exactly, because the point that I wanted to get to is that ideas, you can't protect ideas. And I think that, nowadays, like you said, it's different. People are so hungry, and they want to get their ideas out there, and they don't understand that the idea itself is not protectable, but the execution of that idea is. And I remember
exactly.
several years ago, when I had completed my first screenplay, I read a synopsis online that looked exactly like my screenplay. And, I was a novice and I didn't know anything. I'm like, oh, my goodness, how could they have the same idea as me? Did they steal my idea? And then when I looked at it, the execution of it was something totally different. And that's what I want the point that the listeners to get, is that having the idea is one thing, but the execution of it is something totally different. So make sure that you share your ideas with a trusted source. One thing that I do is that when people ask me to listen to an idea, I'll immediately send them a non-disclosure agreement for both of us to execute, just so that I'm protected myself in case it's something similar to something that I'm writing or that I'm pitching to a network myself.
Right, and that's exactly right. Writers simply don't understand that ideas are not protectable. There's lawsuits all the time going on that simply don't understand the law. I mean, the copyright law was meant to protect the execution of an idea, and just because you have an idea doesn't mean that, and just because you told somebody your idea doesn't mean that you have any ownership over it. And that's why it's so important that you learn how to execute your ideas or find help in doing that. And many of the Writer's Lifeline's bestsellers came from simply having an idea and, creating a novel or a screenplay from it with the writer collaborating with one of our ghostwriters or editors. And that happens all the time, especially in the world of business, where business people need a book written and, they've got an original idea about their business that they can communicate to others, and that leads to a consulting platform for them. We're happy to help them write the book and get it out there. I appear regularly in Rick Frischman's Author 101 to talk about just that. I think the next one's in Las Vegas from October 29th to 31st. And if you have nonfiction writers in your audience, they should definitely sign up and go to that. I'm not going to be at that one because I'll be in London. I'm shooting our Maggie Gyllenhaal movie, but they're about every 3 months, and I'm usually at them. And it's a great forum where you learn the ins and outs of writing, the actual business of writing.
Right. And I think that's something that's important as well. That's something that's key, because having an idea is one thing, and then you actually learning to execute is actually a process. I remember, again, writing my first screenplay. I went to a conference. I learned the importance of going to conferences that where you interact with other writers, you build a community, but you learn the craft of writing as well, because it is a craft, and it's not just putting words on paper. And I'm not one to say there's a specific formula, A plus B equals this, but there are certain things that certain elements that are essential to the success of a story. What do you think are a few essential elements to a good story?
Well, my book, A Writer's Time, has a whole chapter called The Elements of Fiction, Chapter 5, I think, and it outlines them, and basically the number one element is character, because that's what makes people read fiction, is to be intrigued by the characters in the story. If you read the first 3 chapters of a novel and you're not hooked by a character, I don't care how supposedly exciting those chapters are, you just don't get why you're reading it. So character is number one. Number 2 is action. And action is crucial because what makes a story work is action. Otherwise, you'd be writing an essay, a nonfiction book about your thinking. And so many initial writers get confused. They think that if they can write a diary, they can write a novel, and that's simply not true.
Right.
Action has to do with, plot is one element of it, but it basically has to do with a change in the circumstances of the major character. And then, of course, there's the setting, and that's extremely important to a story. And the 4th element is point of view, which is the storyteller as a character in the story and how the story is being told. That's the hardest one to learn. It's the trickiest one. Writers learn it, later in their careers. But it's the one that, kind of divides the sophisticated, successful writers from those who are not, yet sophisticated. But those are the 4 elements that have to be in every story. And aside from that, you have to have a great beginning, a great ending, and a great middle that keeps people going. And an Italian director was once asked if he believed that every story had to have a beginning, middle, and end, and he stopped for a minute and said, yes, but not necessarily in that order, which was his way of saying that originality always has room. And, it's another way of saying what Homer said, that the great artist begins, what Aristotle said about Homer, the great artist begins in the middle of things. He doesn't start with, it was a cold winter's day in Kansas when I was born, or, when the character was born. He starts, and then Achilles said to Agamemnon, and before you know it, in 20 lines, you're in the middle of a huge fight among the gods and among men in front of Troy, and, you're in the story.
Right. I agree with that totally. That makes so much sense. So now I have a question from the chat room. We have a couple of listeners there, and they want to know, do you know of any editors that don't charge an arm and a leg? And based on that question, what do you think, if you're willing to tell us, what do you think are good rates for an editor? Especially given in today's, economic crisis, and realizing that the editors have to work and get paid, and that people, are looking for these services.
Well, you can get editors across the board for any rate at all, probably starting with $25 an hour. Our editors, the Writer's Lifeline, we charge $125 an hour because they're supervised, and you're getting our guarantee that you'll be satisfied with the results. And so that's basically the best answer I can give, other than I would warn people against editors who have no track record, no success in actual selling books, because what makes us different is that, we have been selling books for years, and we're not going to let you write a book that doesn't have the potential of being sold or to getting to its public market. And that's why we cost more. But, there are others that cost $250 an hour, which is the price of my personal coaching. But you can find a local editor probably for, $50 an hour. Just make sure they have a track record, because I can't tell you how many times somebody's brought me something that has been so-called edited for several years, and I look at it and I realize that whoever edited it has zero experience in the commercial world and doesn't understand the standards that editors in New York or, readers in Hollywood are looking for, and it has to be re-edited or just, forgotten about.
Right. Now, that being said, this is a question I want to know the answer to, because I've come across this many times because I'm an avid reader, but I'm an editor at heart, and I have a challenge. If I read a book and there's a typo in the book, I don't want to read the book anymore because I feel like as an author, this is your work, but it's also you paid someone to edit it, or you trusted that person to edit it. And recently, I've come across a book by a very well-known author, and so far I've found 2 typos in the book. What should a reader do in that regard? Is it looked upon? Is it frowned upon? If you contact the publisher and say, hey, by the way, there's a typo there. For me, I think because, I know what's involved in editing, I know what's involved in this industry and how much work it takes, I just think that, when it comes to editing, if you're paying someone for there to be no room for error, there should be no error.
Well, I happen to completely agree with you, and it just appalls me to see people publishing books where the commas are outside the quotation marks and where the, where the words where it's is spelled ITS instead of IT apostrophe S or vice versa. It just appalls me, and it's because there's so much stuff being put out there. Writers not believing those things are important, but what it shows is a lack of respect not only for the English language but for the reader, and certainly the sophisticated reader has a right to be upset by that, and of course you should contact the publisher and complain because, when the publisher slips like that, it means they're not using a copy editor and they're trying to take shortcuts, and that to me spells the end, the beginning to the end of a publisher.
Right. Yeah, so that's very important, and it's just something that irks me. I agree. Seeing from someone that's a professional, and it's funny because I've had friends, and I'll start reading a book and I'm really enjoying the book, and I'm like, there's a typo, and they're like, okay, you're not gonna not read that book because of that typo. Yeah, I'm gonna have to learn to overcome that challenge one day, but I just feel like it to me it just sets a different tone for me entirely, again, and not necessarily the author, but the editor, because you chose that editor, you co-signed that editor, and they're someone who would pay specifically to accomplish that task.
That's right. And if an editor is making mistakes like that, you've wasted your money on the editor. The least you should do is go back to the editor and ask them to fix it. And any good editor will respond to that positively and will fix it, because the last thing you want is to have the word out there. I mean, I'm always appalled when I see a typo on one of my own websites, because I'm always, preaching this message, and so I check all my websites every day, and anybody who reads them should, don't feel, shy about hollering if you find one, because we all are very careful, but, mistakes still happen, and you want to correct those mistakes, because it's just a matter of pride in craftsmanship. And to me, that is the only standard that's worthwhile, is the perfect standard. You'll never reach it, but it's a lot better than thinking 80% is your standard, Right.
That makes sense. So now, how important is, I read a recent interview that you did on Media Bistro that was hosted by a mutual friend of ours, Jeff Rivera, where you mentioned that you're looking now to build brands and not just titles. How important is branding?
Well, branding is where, is where it's at. I mean, because we're kind of out of time today, maybe we should do another one on branding someday. I'd be happy to come back. But branding is, because we live in such a jungle environment in the market, to get to know somebody and to go through the whole effort of a new relationship, people would much rather do it if they think that what you've got has legs and is a whole brand. So we do brand launches for, people, and we show them, like, the potential of a brand, and as I said, I'd be happy to talk about that in detail sometime.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, we'd love to have you come back on the show and talk about your other projects. Now, for people, there's also a question in the chat room. People want to know, how can they contact you, to send the query letter in case they're interested in submitting to you, or to avail themselves of any of your services? Is there an email address, or do they go to the website?
No, the best email address is drk@storymerchant.com.
Okay.
And I'd be happy,
Well,
happy to get email from your